I remember the first day at the train station as if it just happened. It wasn't the kind of job anyone dreams of, but it paid the bills, and I needed a fresh start. The ad was straightforward: night shift operator needed. No prior experience required. It sounded almost too easy, but I wasn't about to question good fortune. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. The station itself was tucked away in the outskirts of a small, sleepy town. A place where you could walk down the street and not see another soul for hours. When I arrived, the air was crisp, and the sky was just beginning to lose its light. There was a strange stillness to it all, as if the station had been paused in time. The building was old, made of red brick that had darkened over the years. A flickering fluorescent bulb above the entrance cast uneven shadows on the worn concrete steps. I hesitated for a moment, looking up at the rusted clock above the door. It wasn't working. No ticking, no hands moving. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. The floors creaked beneath my boots, and the walls were lined with faded posters, their edges curling. Most of them advertised events from decades ago: a traveling circus, a farmer's market, even a notice for a lost dog. The station manager, Mr. Conway, met me at the front desk. He was an older man with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. "You're here for the night shift?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Well, it's simple enough," he said, pushing a clipboard across the counter. "Sign here and I'll show you the ropes. Trains come through on schedule, but there's no one driving them. Don't worry about that. It's been automated for years." That last part caught me off guard. "No drivers?" I asked, frowning. He waved it off as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "You'll get used to it." I signed the papers, my pen dragging a little too slowly across the page. For a brief moment, I thought I saw him watching me closely, his lips pressed into a thin line. But when I looked up, his expression was neutral. Mr. Conway led me through the station, explaining the basics. "You'll be working here in the control room," he said, opening a door to a small, windowless office filled with monitors and buttons. The screens displayed various parts of the station: platforms, waiting areas, and the tracks stretching into the darkness. "Just keep an eye on these," he said, pointing to the screens. "If something looks off, make a note of it." "What kind of off?" I asked. He shrugged. "You'll know it when you see it." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I spent the next hour settling in, familiarizing myself with the equipment. The monitors flickered occasionally, and the static hum of the speakers filled the room. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint sounds like whispers, but they were so soft I convinced myself it was just interference. By midnight, the station was completely silent. No passengers, no announcements, just me, the screens, and the occasional rumble of an approaching train. The trains came and went like clockwork, their headlights cutting through the darkness before disappearing into the void. But there was something unsettling about the way they moved. Smooth, precise, like they were alive. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. One of the trains stopped at the platform, its doors sliding open. But no one got on or off. It just sat there for a while, the doors yawning into emptiness, before closing again and pulling away. I glanced at the logbook. No mention of a train scheduled at that time. When Mr. Conway returned in the morning, I told him about it. He didn't react the way I expected. Instead of asking questions, he simply nodded and said, "It happens. It happens?" I repeated, confused. He didn't elaborate. "You'll learn not to overthink things here," he said before walking away, leaving me alone in the quiet, fading daylight. As I left that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the station wasn't right. It wasn't just the empty trains or Mr. Conway's cryptic behavior. It was the way the place seemed to breathe when no one was looking. And that metallic scent, it stayed with me, clinging to my clothes long after I was gone. The next few nights at the station passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. My shifts were quiet, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound. The trains kept to their schedules, rolling in and out without a single passenger or driver. I told myself I'd adjust, that I'd find comfort in the monotony. But the station had a way of pushing back against that comfort. One evening, just before my shift, I arrived a little early. Mr. Conway was at the front desk, speaking with a woman in a maintenance uniform. She seemed agitated, her voice low but tense. "I'm telling you, it's not safe," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Mr. Conway glanced at me as I walked in, then turned back to her, his voice firm but quiet enough that I couldn't make out the words. The woman shook her head, muttering something before walking out. "What was that about?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nothing you need to worry about," Mr. Conway said quickly, giving me a tight smile. "People like to talk." As the night wore on, I started noticing little things, small, inconsequential details that began to add up. For starters, the cleaning crew never worked past 8 p.m. They'd mop floors, empty trash bins, and tidy up, but as soon as the clock struck 8, they packed up and left in a hurry. Once, I asked one of the workers, a young guy named Malik, why they always left so early. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the hallway leading to the platforms. "Just the way it is," he said, shrugging. "You'll get used to it." Before I could press him further, he was gone, his cart rattling down the corridor. By my third week, patterns began to emerge. For example, the station's vending machines, they were ancient, the kind that looked like they hadn't been stocked in decades. And yet, every morning, they'd be refilled, the shelves neatly arranged with chips and candy bars that no one seemed to buy. Then there was the clock in the main hall. It was a relic, with its brass casing and Roman numerals. But no matter the time of day, its hands were always stuck at 3:17. I pointed it out to Mr. Conway once. "It's been like that for years," he said, not even glancing up from his paperwork. "Doesn't bother anyone. It bothered me." The strangest thing, though, was the way people acted when they were inside the station. During the day, the staff were friendly enough. Polite smiles, nods of acknowledgement. But there was something about their demeanor that changed when the sun went down. They became quieter, their conversations shorter. There was no laughter, no small talk. And when the last train of the evening pulled out, they all disappeared like clockwork. One night, I tried to stay behind after my shift, hoping to catch one of them before they left. I wanted to ask if they'd noticed anything odd about the place. But as soon as the platform emptied, I heard it. A faint humming sound, like distant machinery. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something off about it. The kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just old pipes or the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But the more I told myself that, the less convincing it sounded. "It's just an old building," I whispered under my breath, staring at the monitors. Old buildings make noise, but why did it only happen after everyone else was gone? One night, around 3 a.m., I noticed something on the monitors. One of the cameras facing the tracks showed a figure standing on the platform. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the overhead lamps. But then it moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift of the head, like it was looking around. I grabbed the radio and called Mr. Conway. "There's someone on the platform," I said, my voice low but urgent. "Probably a stray," he replied, his tone calm. "Happens sometimes. Should I go check it out?" I asked, already reaching for my flashlight. "Leave it," he said firmly. "It'll sort itself out." Sort itself out? I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. By the time I looked again, the platform was empty. The next morning, I asked Mr. Conway about the figure. "Don't overthink it," he said, his tone dismissive. "This place has its quirks. That's all." But it wasn't just the quirks. It was the way people avoided certain areas after dark. The way their conversations would trail off whenever the station's history came up. The way everyone seemed to follow unspoken rules that no one bothered to explain. And that humming sound? It wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting louder. The humming sound had been bothering me for days now. It wasn't constant. It came and went in waves, always after midnight. I asked Mr. Conway about it again, trying to sound casual, but his response was the same. This place has its quirks. That's what he called it. Quirks. Like the vending machines that refilled themselves. Or the trains that showed up with no drivers. Or the figure I'd seen on the platform that just disappeared. But quirks don't make you feel like you're being watched. One night, as I settled into my shift, I noticed the control room felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling, like the air was heavier than usual. The screens flickered more than they normally did, and the static hum from the speakers seemed louder, sharper. I told myself it was nothing, just the equipment acting up. But then, around 1 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps echoing down the empty corridor outside the control room. I froze, my eyes darting to the monitor that showed the hallway. There was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response, just silence. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, but it didn't. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand and check. The hallway was empty. Later that same night, I decided to walk the platforms, hoping it would calm my nerves. I told myself I just needed a break from the control room, from the screens and the humming and the empty trains. The platform was as quiet as ever, the only sound the faint rumble of a train in the distance. But as I turned the corner toward the south wing, I noticed something odd. There was a door at the end of the hallway, an old wooden door with a brass handle. I'd seen it before, but it was always locked. Mr. Conway had told me it led to a storage room they hadn't used in years. But now it was open. The door creaked softly as I approached, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. The air coming from below was cool and damp, carrying that same faint metallic scent I'd noticed on my first night. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the blackness, my hand gripping the railing. Part of me wanted to go down to see where it led, but the rest of me, the smarter part, knew better. I shut the door and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. Back in the control room, I tried to shake the feeling of unease. I stared at the monitors, watching as one train after another pulled into the station, sat for a few minutes, and left again. But then, just after 2 a.m., something caught my eye. A train was pulling into platform 4, its headlights cutting through the dark. I checked the schedule. There wasn't supposed to be a train on platform 4 tonight. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers hovering over the controls. The train came to a stop, its doors sliding open. Nobody got off. Nobody got on. I waited, watching the empty platform. The train sat there for a long time, too long. Just as I was about to radio Mr. Conway, the doors slid shut, and the train pulled away, disappearing into the tunnel. When I checked the logbook, there was no record of it. By now, I was starting to question everything. Had I really seen that figure on the platform the other night? Were the footsteps just my imagination? And what about the door, the one that was supposed to be locked? I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was just overthinking things. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. And that humming sound? It was louder than ever. Before my shift ended, I decided to check the south wing one last time. The hallway was empty, the lights buzzing faintly above me. I approached the door at the end, half expecting it to be open again. But it wasn't. It was shut tight, the brass handle cold under my fingers. As I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound of a train whistle echoing through the station. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3:17. The sound of the train whistle lingered in the air longer than it should have, fading slowly into a silence that felt too deliberate. I stood there, staring at the clock stuck at 3:17, my breath caught somewhere between a sigh and a gasp. It wasn't a scheduled train. I knew that much. But then again, the trains here didn't seem to care much about schedules or rules. For a moment, I thought about going back to the control room, shutting the door, and pretending I hadn't heard anything. But something made me stay. When I returned to the control room, the monitors were flickering more than usual. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and insistent, like it was trying to tell me something. On one of the screens, I noticed movement, platform 3. The figure stood there just like before, tall, motionless, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but it wasn't a trick of the light this time. It was real. "Who the hell are you?" I muttered, leaning closer to the screen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing the train tracks as if waiting for something or someone. I reached for the radio, my hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Conway, there's someone on platform 3, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The response crackled back almost immediately. "Ignore it." "What do you mean, ignore it?" I shot back, my frustration boiling over. There was a pause on the other end. "Just stay in the control room. Don't go out there." The line went dead before I could respond. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. The rest of the shift was uneventful, or so I tried to tell myself. But the longer I sat there, the more I noticed a new sound underneath the usual hum of the station. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A low, rhythmic knocking, like someone tapping on a wooden door. It started off slow. Knock, 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 but soon grew faster, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the walls. I checked the monitors, expecting to see something, anything, but everything looked normal. Just the pipes, I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. By the time the knocking stopped, I was already on edge. I decided to distract myself by going through the night's roster, double-checking the train schedules against the logs. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a train listed at 3:17, one that I hadn't seen before. The name was blurred, the text barely legible, but the time was clear. It had arrived at platform 4 and departed exactly 3 minutes later. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. How could it be there when it wasn't on the schedule earlier? And why was the entry so distorted? The next morning, as I was leaving, I bumped into Malik in the break room. He was finishing up his cleaning rounds, his usual cheerful demeanor noticeably absent. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. "Maybe I have," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in, his voice low. "Listen, don't stay here past your shift. And whatever you do, don't go near that door again." "Why?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Some things in this place aren't meant to be messed with," he said finally. "Just trust me on this." That night, the station was quieter than usual. Even the humming sound seemed distant, as if it were holding its breath. I was sitting in the control room, staring blankly at the monitors, when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Help me," it said. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was coming from the speakers, the static warping the words into something unnatural. "Help me," the voice repeated, more urgent this time. I grabbed the radio, my hand shaking. "Mr. Conway, there's something on the speakers," I stammered. The line crackled, but there was no response. The voice came again, louder now, almost a scream. "Help me!" I slammed the radio down, my heart racing. I sat there, staring at the monitors, waiting for something, anything to happen. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the static in its wake. That's when the screen showing Platform 3 flickered back to life. The figure was there again, but this time it wasn't alone. The figure on the monitor wasn't alone. Two more shadows had joined it, standing motionless on Platform 3. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the hum of the speakers. The new figures were just as indistinct, more shapes than people. They didn't move, didn't interact with each other, just stood there, facing the tracks. The static on the speakers returned, louder now, rising and falling in strange, uneven waves. And then, layered beneath it, I heard something else. A faint, rhythmic knocking. It was the same sound I'd heard the other night, only now it was faster, closer. I turned to check the other monitors, hoping for some sign of normalcy. But the screen showing the control room door flickered and went black. "Come on," I muttered, tapping the console. The other monitors worked fine, but that one stayed dark. A chill ran through me. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. Didn't. But the sound of knocking, the same one coming from the speakers, was now coming from the other side of that door. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaking. No response, just the relentless knock. 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 I knew I should stay put, lock the door, and wait for my shift to end. That's what any reasonable person would do. But something about the knocking felt wrong. Like it wasn't just someone trying to get in. It was something else entirely. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dim light. I headed toward Platform 3, each step slower than the last. The closer I got, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. The posters on the walls looked different, newer, as if they'd been replaced overnight. The vending machines were spotless, their glass fronts gleaming. When I reached the platform, my flashlight caught the edge of a shoe. I froze. The three figures from the monitor were standing there, exactly as I'd seen them, but now they were clear, solid, real. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You're not supposed to be here." They didn't respond. I took a step closer, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep the flashlight steady. The beam landed on the nearest figure, a man in a dark coat. His head turned slightly, just enough for me to see his face, or rather, the absence of one. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The other two figures turned toward me in unison, their heads tilting at unnatural angles. A low rumble echoed through the station, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath my feet vibrated as a train pulled into the platform. Its headlights were blinding, the screech of its brakes deafening. But there was no driver, no passengers, just the empty cars stretching into the darkness. The doors slid open, and for a moment, everything went silent. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring or at least facing me, as if waiting for me to do something. My mind raced. Should I run back to the control room, call for help, or step onto the train? None of the options made sense, but standing there wasn't an option either. "Get on," a voice whispered. I spun around, but no one was there. The platform was empty except for me and the figures, who had now turned toward the open doors of the train. The voice came again, louder this time. "Get on." It was coming from the speakers. The train doors began to close, and without thinking, I ran toward them. The figures didn't follow me. Instead, they stayed on the platform, their faceless heads tilting as if to watch me leave. I stepped onto the train just as the doors slid shut behind me. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, and the metallic scent I'd noticed before was overwhelming now. The train lurched forward, the lights flickering as it sped into the tunnel. I turned to look out the window, but the platform was gone. There was nothing outside, just darkness. The train sped forward, the sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks echoing endlessly inside the empty cars. I sat frozen in one of the seats, gripping the cold metal armrest. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. There were no announcements, no signs of a destination. Just that hum. The same hum I'd heard in the station, only now it surrounded me, pressing against my ears. I stared out the window, but there was nothing to see. The darkness outside was impenetrable, a void that swallowed everything. After what felt like hours, the train began to slow. The screech of the brakes made my teeth clench, and for a moment, I thought it might stop in the middle of nowhere. But then I saw it. A platform, dimly lit and eerily familiar. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and approached the door. The train came to a halt, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Stepping onto the platform felt like stepping into a dream or a nightmare. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic scent that seemed to follow me everywhere. The station looked almost identical to the one I just left, but something was off. The posters on the walls were different, the benches slightly rearranged. And then there was the clock. Its hands were frozen, just like the clock back at the station. 3:17. Always 3:17. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at it, the sound of the train pulling away behind me. I didn't turn around to watch it go. Couldn't. The platform was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the tiles. The lights above buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to cast shifting shadows on the walls. The shadows didn't move in time with me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and turned to look behind me. There was no one there, just the empty platform stretching into the dark. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I turned back to the exit and kept walking, my pace quickening with each step. When I finally stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. The small town was quiet, the streets empty, just as they always were. But something felt wrong. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting pale, uneven light on the pavement. The houses looked the same, but their windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. As I walked home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The figures, the train, the strange platform. It all felt unreal, like a fever dream I couldn't wake up from. But my hands were still shaking, and my clothes still smelled faintly of metal. I quit the job the next day. Mr. Conway didn't seem surprised when I handed in my resignation. He just nodded, his face unreadable. "You'll be back," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't think so," I replied, forcing a weak smile. As I left the station for the last time, I glanced back over my shoulder. The building loomed in the distance, its windows dark and empty. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the entrance, a tall figure in a dark coat. But when I blinked, it was gone. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that night. I still hear the hum sometimes, faint and distant, like it's following me. Every time I see a train, I freeze, my heart racing as I watch it roll past. I can't help but check the windows, looking for passengers who aren't there. And the knocking, it's the worst. Every so often, late at night, I'll hear it again. Soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. I try to tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. The clock on my wall stopped last week. Stuck at 3:17. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.